Hello, and welcome to the Society of Women Engineers webinar on donor cultivation and stewardship, ensuring sustainability for your fundraising efforts. My name is Hannah Eichler-George, and I work as the Manager of Fund Development at SWE-HQ. If you have questions, please feel free to submit them via the question box on the right-hand panel of your screen, or email them to me at funddevelopment@swe.org. This webinar is the third webinar in a three-part series that is designed for section leadership and international affiliate leadership around institutional fundraising practices. The first webinar focuses on developing your own case statement and identifying funders and beginning initial stages of solicitation. The second webinar focuses on measuring your program, and of course this webinar is focused on funder cultivation. I encourage you to review all of these webinars and the relevant attachments and supporting documents that we've developed to support these webinars in your efforts to improve the institutional fundraising practices for your SWE organization. These webinars are designed for SWE leaders and SWE section leaders in particular. They are developed with an introductory focus. Therefore, if you have established fundraising practices or are very experienced in your fundraising endeavors, you may find much of what we're discussing to be simple and at the beginning stages. Throughout this particular webinar, we will focus on learning about the 5 cultivation points for managing institutional donor relationships, which would be introduction, request, stewardship, recognition, and reporting. The objectives of this webinar are to learn best practices in establishing relationships with institutional funders, understanding the critical stages in the grant request process, learning how to develop unique recognition strategies, develop processes to ensure excellent stewardship is embraced by your organization, and understand how to track and fulfill reporting requirements. Again, the content is focused for SWE section and international affiliates or other SWE organizations. This is an introductory framework, and we are focusing specifically on fundraising practices for institutional donors, which may be foundations, family foundations, or corporate entities with a fundraising or philanthropic arm or focus. While we are not focusing on developing individual donor relationships through this webinar, much of what we are discussing can be transferred to the donor relationships that you are managing. Before we get started, here are a few simple rules to remember in any donor cultivation, and these actually can always be used for individual donor cultivation as well. This is not an exhaustive rule list. It's not meant to be overwhelming or overbearing, but these are simple, common sense ideas that are important in any successful donor cultivation effort. So first and foremost, always remember that donors are people. Sometimes it can be intimidating to approach a major philanthropic entity that maybe makes millions, if not billions, of donations. However, it's important to remember that anyone you're engaging with is a person, and you are a person, and it's important to develop a relational approach when you're cultivating donors. Another pattern that I always encourage people to remember is to listen first, ask questions second, and talk third. Oftentimes when approaching funders, it can be a little bit nerve-wracking, especially at the beginning of the process. Therefore, it is important when you're sitting down with a funder and you have their ear for you to start by saying, tell me about your funding priorities or your guidelines for submitting requests, or what you think is a successful fundraising application, or how do you feel as though your current partnerships aren't fulfilling your priorities, and what do you want to identify in a new funding relationship. getting your donor or potential donor to start talking is really important in any conversation that you're having. This helps them ensure that you want to develop a relationship with them and you value them not only as an individual but as a grant-making entity. A good relationship is always mutually advantageous. So with any relationship that you might have, you want to make sure that you are fulfilling the mission of your SWE organization and that you're fulfilling the mission and priorities of the fundraising and grant-making entity. So if the grant that you receive to do the work that you're doing is directed at a program that you don't want to do but is in line with the corporate or foundation entity, you're ultimately not going to be fulfilled. And if the grant you receive is for funding or is for a program that the grant-making entity does not want to do, they are not going to be fulfilled. And ultimately, if there isn't a mutually advantageous grant relationship, the funding relationship is not going to be long-term and will not be able to be sustained. So you want to make sure that whatever relationship you begin is mutually advantageous. It's really important to identify your unique values and rely on them in donor cultivation efforts. I always encourage individuals to pause and take a moment to reflect on what makes them unique as people and what the values are that they hold really dear, and to continue to rely on those. For example, some values that I personally hold dear are fulfilling what I say I will fulfill, hard work, and honesty. So those are values that I think come through in the donor relationships that I manage. Finally, you want to have confidence in your programming and your work. If you don't have confidence in your programming or your work, that hesitancy will be easily communicated to the donor that you're speaking with. And if you don't have confidence, you might want to take a step back and look at your case statement or your research that you've done about the funder or your program management strategies. Ensuring that you're able to have a solid framework before you approach a donor will help you have confidence and is really important to your success. So here are some tips to successful introductions. How do you start a conversation with an institutional funder? And these are steps that I went over in the first webinar in this series, so I won't spend a lot of time with them here. But you want to remember these key questions when you're approaching a funder. Have the answers to these ready before you engage with the potential funder or funder. So what are their geographic preferences? Are there deadlines for funding opportunities? What is the typical award amount? You want to make sure that you're not asking for too little or too much. How do you submit a request? Do you submit a request online, in paper? Does it have to be received by a certain date? Does it have to be sent by a certain date? Does it have to be received at a certain time of day? Oftentimes, especially with federal grants, they want them to be submitted by 5 p.m. at the submitter's time, local time zone. You want to make sure you have all this information that might be publicly available at your fingertips before you contact a funder. You also want to know if the funder accepts unsolicited grant proposals. So can you submit a cold request without having prior funding from the philanthropic entity, or do you need to first submit a letter of inquiry, which we'll go over in a moment, before you can submit a formal request? Always figure out if the foundation or corporate funder has staff. If they do, that means it's much more likely that you'll be able to reach somebody and have a conversation with them prior to submitting a request. If they don't, it will be much harder to get a hold of them. And also, you always want to have an ask in the back of your mind. Very infrequently do I start a first conversation with a funder and it ends with them saying, well, what do you want to ask for? But it has happened. So if you picked up the phone and had a perfect conversation, what would you ask for? Make sure you have that ask ready. So here's some tips for how to approach a funder over email. Be brief and to the point. Include lengthy documents as an attachment. Use links sparingly. Make sure that your email is personal and both unique. You don't want to copy and paste the same email to a bunch of different people. You want to customize it. Double check every word to make sure that your email is going to the right person, that you've included the right salutation, that you haven't included the wrong corporate or foundation name. Sometimes if you're doing a lot of outreach and you may be reusing material, you may accidentally include the wrong foundation name or corporate entity. This is a huge, huge mistake to make, especially when you're beginning a relationship, so you want to make sure you double check every word of your email. Ensure that you're addressing your email to the right person. So if there is a recommended contact for new applicants, you want to reach out to that applicant. You may not want to start by reaching out to the board chair or president or CEO of the entity that you're engaging with. Make one specific ask in the email. So very infrequently should you email and say, we want to request $50,000 or $10,000 for our outreach program. You want to start with something much easier. So if you're sending an email, maybe you want to request a phone call or an answer to an application question that you can't figure out, or just to better understand funding priorities. Be very concrete and make your ask very specific and simple over email so that the receiver of the email is able to provide a easy response. You want to put them in a position to respond to you at ease. Here's some tips for starting phone calls. So always do your homework, right, on both the institution and the individual that you're calling. You want to make sure that you understand their background. Ensure that you're the right person to make the call and that you're calling the right person. So again, this is very similar to, are you sending the email to the right person? If there's a point of contact that you should reach out to, make sure that you are at the right level to reach out to this person. This really only comes into play if you're trying to contact maybe a higher level executive at a company. You may not want to be, you may not want to give this responsibility to one of your newer section members. This may be someone that needs to be at the president or higher level leadership within your local SWE organization, so that whoever is calling a higher level executive at a foundation or corporation is well versed on your organization. Again, you want to make it easy for the person on the other end of the line to give you what you need. So you want to start off the conversation in a very approachable tone, a very friendly tone, and begin with a simple question. Always make sure that you are smiling when you're talking. It makes it much more engaging and approachable for the person who's picking up the phone conversation. So phone conversations are always really hard, right? But starting off with a simple starter such as, I'm calling to better understand your fundraising guide or your funding or grant making guidelines. Are you the right person for me to speak to? Or I've read about your funding priorities online, but I still have a few questions about my organization's eligibility. Who can I talk to? These are very common, easy conversation starters that any newcomer to fundraising can use and employ when they're picking up the phone to have a conversation with an institutional funder or new institutional funder. Finally, making conversations through letters. So sometimes you won't be able to get in contact with a funder via email or via a phone call. If this is the case, you may want to send a letter of introduction or inquiry. What is the difference between these two? A letter of inquiry requests permission to submit a specific funding request for a particular program or operational need. So you may say, I'm writing to request permission to request support for my program, and then you'll provide some brief details about your program in this letter. A letter of introduction does not make any requests whatsoever. It's simply informative. So if you're dealing with a funder who does not accept unsolicited grant requests, sending a letter of introduction or making an introductory phone call is really your only strategy. You're putting the funder on, you're putting your program on the funder's radar so that a funding relationship can be established down the line. And believe it or not, I have succeeded, and it is possible to succeed from foundations that do not accept unsolicited grant requests by beginning with a letter of introduction, especially if you are confident that your program is directly aligned with the mission of the grant-making entity. You always want to keep these letters short, 1 to 2 pages max, and ensure you adhere to the guidelines for letters. Sometimes funders want very specific information in a very concise format in these letters, so you want to make sure that you are providing exactly what they want. You always want to ensure that you highlight how your mission directly fulfills the funder's interests. And finally, you want to make sure that you let them know how you can be contacted or how they can contact another key point within your organization. So moving on to how to submit requests. Again, you want to triple check your guidelines and the guidelines of the funder before submitting any requests. Your requests will be taken seriously only if you are in compliance with existing protocols. So just like any engineering task, you want to make sure that you follow directions. Engineers are perhaps the best equipped to submit grant requests because they are very detail-oriented and able to directly respond to specific requests for information. So oftentimes some grant requests can be and grant application structures can be very, very detailed oriented. So you want to make sure that your request is very specific and what you're communicating is very clear at the beginning of your proposal and is supported throughout your proposal. Here are some sample language to include or to consider including. The Society of Women Engineers is pleased to request a grant in the amount of $50,000 to support our K-12 outreach programming from the Jane Smith Educational Foundation. This is a fictional request, but it's not unlike the request that SWE-HQ submits to our institutional fundraisers. Having done this for almost 7 years now, I often am asked by my friends who have nonprofit organizations to look over their grant applications and their grant proposals, and I am surprised when I evaluate grant proposals by individuals that they are just not explicit at the very beginning of their request on what they want. And you want to make sure that you're very explicit in asking for what you want so that you and the fundraising entity are on the same page. And directly connect your request to the mission and funding priority of the institutional donor. And once you submit your request, follow up by email or by phone as appropriate to ensure that the funder is in receipt of your materials. So a lot of developing a request and developing your fundraising objectives and your programmatic objectives we go over in the first and second webinar in this series. So the specifics of how you write a request, aside from this slide, I'm not going to go over in any more detail, but I do want to encourage you to look at the case statement sample and sample proposal that we attached within our first webinar in this series, and the sample objectives and goals and logic models that we went over in the second webinar of this series. If you have questions about how to develop the actual language for a proposal, and again, we will be providing the recordings of all of these webinars and all of the templates and sample supporting documents at the conclusion of this webinar series, and we'll be sending them out to all section leaderships in the next 2 weeks. And we'll also be referring to them on an annual basis for new section leadership at the beginning of each fiscal year. So once you submit your request, it's important to have some stewardship and recognition practices whether or not your request is approved or declined. This will help you begin a long-term partnership. And ultimately, as hard as this is to hear, the most common word that people hear in developing institutional funding relationships is no. So on average, you might hear no 6 times before you hear a yes, but it is very possible to turn a no into a yes if you follow some simple steps. I've often heard no several times before I have encountered a yes with an institutional funder. It's just a matter of getting to know them and having them getting to know you and building up that rapport and trust and confidence that the dollars they are distributing will be put to effective and good use through the program that you are developing. So here are some steps in that process to ensure that you're successful in building the first step of a longer-term partnership. So regardless of the outcome of the funding request, always thank the institutional funder for their consideration. So if you receive a award or a decline, send a thank you for your donation or thank you for your consideration letter right away, and we'll be following up with templates for these communication pieces. Also follow up with a phone call to either thank the donor for their contribution or ask how you can improve your funding request in the future. Oftentimes, especially if you can't have a phone conversation or an email exchange with a funder prior to submitting an application, you still want to submit that application, because sometimes the only strategy is to get a decline and then start the conversation by asking how you can improve. This seems like an obvious step, but it's a hard step to take for many program individuals and many fundraisers, but it is an important one to do, especially if you really want to build that relationship. So picking up the phone and saying, thank you so much for taking the time to consider our application. We know that you can't fund us right now, but we'd love to know how we can improve on what we submitted to you, or if you have any questions or concerns about what we said that prevented you from funding us in this cycle. We'd love to hear, your thoughts. It is a really simple way to start a conversation with an institutional funder who's given you a decline. At the same time, you want to also call them and thank them if they have given you a positive response. This goes back to the lesson around how funders are people, and it's important to continue to develop a relationship with them in a really meaningful way. In the first webinar, we went over using a grants tracker, and we provided a sample grants tracker for you to use. And if you do receive a grant, you want to record and update any reporting deadlines and future submission deadlines as soon as the grant is received. This ensures that you have the deadlines in your calendar to submit any due diligence reports or updates that might be needed to remain in compliance with your grant. Sometimes grant awards come with grant agreements that must be signed by the leader or fiscal agent within your organization, so ensure that those grant agreements are signed right away, especially because they often may need to be in receipt by the grant-making entity before a check can be dispersed. And you'll want to sign the grant agreement and include a thank you letter in the same packet that you submit to the funder. And of course, this goes without saying, but we'll repeat it here as well, always keep copies of these documents. And you want to keep all financial paperwork, which includes the check, award letter, any signed grant agreement, any grant report that you have submitted, any funding requests that you have submitted as well, for at least 7 years. And if your organization submits to an audit and needs to keep financial paperwork, it might be the grant award and the award letter and award agreement and your check, you may want to consider just making an extra copy and keeping a separate file for auditing purposes. This is what I do at SWE-HQ whenever we receive a institutional grant. I keep a separate file, and then when the auditor comes and requests them, I'm able to provide them without having to spend a lot of time to go through files. And this makes our finance department's job a lot easier and saves my time and my department's time, resources, and staff time when it comes time each year for auditing requests to come around. And ultimately, this will help you and your SWE organization to spend less time searching for paperwork and more time doing the activities that really are meaningful to you. So here are some tips on recognition, and this is really important to sustaining a long-term partnership. This really deals with the communication strategies and also plays into the fact that donors are simply people, and it's important to build a relationship with them. So I'm going to go to the final tip here on the page and just preface all of this with saying that when you're communicating with donors, you want to make sure that you are not only talking to them when you are submitting a request for support. You want to talk to them throughout the year or fundraising cycle. So first of all, before you recognize a donor or institutional funder, you want to make sure that you can recognize them publicly. Oftentimes, some donors may want to be anonymous. So in addition to recognizing your donor in any traditional way, maybe through signage or in your annual report, consider these approaches. List donors and their logos on your website, maybe write a blog post on your organization's website that highlights how a grant has enabled you to fulfill your mission or program. Thank your donors publicly at events where they're present. Invite your funders to attend a site visit or observe the programming that you're doing that they are supporting in person. Always ensure that you have a host for the donor if they do come, and that that host is prepped on what the donor has done. And that if the donor does arrive at an event, that they are publicly thanked and introduced at the beginning and the end of the event, or at least at the beginning and the end of their time at an event. Consider including a handwritten note with your formal thank you letter, maybe that's signed by a couple of people in your section or affiliate or organization. You might want to send a card around a culturally appropriate holiday or time of the year. So if there is a time of the year for your organization that the vast majority of people within your particular culture are celebrating, you may want to send a card. Frequently this may be around any sort of annual holiday that gives thanks or is starting a new year, or where many different religious traditions or observing a time of remembrance or celebration. Frequently, it's important to highlight donors if they can be publicly recognized on social media. Always remember to tag them or hashtag them or at them as appropriate via the platform that you're using. And consider just dropping them an email when you've heard of an accomplishment that they've made. So oftentimes, corporate entities will have corporate responsibility reports or achievements that they've made, or maybe have received an award, or a foundation or family foundation may have conducted a study, or their foundation staff may have presented at an event. If you hear about this, consider just dropping them a note. One way to ensure that you're hearing about the work that your funders are doing is to subscribe for Google alerts for their foundation or corporate entity. So here we're getting to the end of this webinar, and here are some strategies around reporting and evaluation. It's important to ensure that you're communicating the results of your work. So tips for fulfilling reporting requirements include, again, record all critical milestones in your internal tracker. Ensure that your program staff or the individuals that are carrying out the proposed work that you submitted for the grant are aware and are able to be in compliance with a grant agreement. So you may want to set up a post-award grant meeting that's brief, that just goes over the award or the award letter and includes any stakeholders who are leading the grant proposed outcomes. You'll want to ensure that you determine how to track data. Maybe you want to ask key stakeholders who are administering the grant to report data to you on a quarterly or at least annually basis. You want to make sure that you go over the reporting requirements and your proposed objectives to ensure that everyone is on the same page. This is especially important for larger grants that extend over an entire year, or is equally important for grants that are for one-time events. Remind program staff or key stakeholders of reporting deadlines well before they are due. So if you need information from your different volunteers within your or staff within your organization, if you ever are in the place where you're administering staff under a grant, which also pertains to engineers as they are in their who may be receiving federal funds for the work that they are doing. You want to make sure that you and your staff are responsible for the deadlines and are aware of the deadlines well before they are due so you can be prepared. And if you're meeting a funder, perhaps you've invited them to an event, or if you want to go in for a meeting to discuss your application or report prior to or after a deadline, you want to make sure that everyone who's attending that meeting is well prepped and prepared for any possible questions and answers that might need to be communicated. So always submit program reports early, and always or submit program reports early, and if not early, always by the deadline. And after you've submitted a report, make sure you follow up by email or phone with your point of contact to discuss any questions or concerns, and at the very least, verify they are in receipt of your grant report. This entire presentation really is on the foundation of this donor cultivation cycle, which relies on missional alignment. You want to make sure that you and the donor have the same missional alignment and priorities, that you're submitting a relevant request, that you are recognizing the donor and the gift in a meaningful way. So you want to make sure you understand what is meaningful to the donor or institutional grant maker in recognizing them, that you're regularly and in a timely fashion reporting on your grant-funded activities, that you're continuously evaluating your priorities to ensure that, again, at the top of the cycle here, there is direct missional alignment between what you are doing and what the priorities of the grant-making entity are. And as we have focused on in each of these webinars in this three-part series, SWE has recently developed a research site that has a lot of information and background data and recent statistics that you can use in effectively communicating the need that your program is meeting within the community to any institutional funder. Oftentimes, if there is a recent piece of research that has been developed by the SWE research site and published there that might be directly pertinent to a funder that you're communicating with or trying to cultivate, you might want to send them a link to the article and say, you know, hey, we, you know, SWE-HQ, or we recently published this article, and it really demonstrates the need that we as a SWE organization, whether it be a local affiliate or section, are trying to meet in our community. We think that you would find it interesting. Here's a link to it. Feel free to check it out. It doesn't have to be a long email or a super formal email. Of course, you want to make sure it is a professional communication, but it's good to send these touch points to institutional donors and prospective institutional donors as you are building the relationship. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. This concludes our broadcast. If you have any questions, please feel free to direct them to me at funddevelopment@SWE.org. And again, we will be submitting all of our webinars and our attachments and supporting templates in an email to you all and other section leaderships in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye out for that. Thank you again, and have a good rest of your evening.